The silver reckoning has arrived, and the long-awaited truth is finally being brought into the cold light of justice today. Experience the high-stakes drama of a final confrontation where every past action meets its final, permanent consequence. Subscribe now and watch the scales of fate finally balance out. The morning my grandson turned 21, I noticed something that had nothing to do with birthday cake or champagne. It was the way my son-in-law kept looking at the filing cabinet in the corner of my home office. I had left the door open by accident. My daughter Claire had asked me to grab a sweater from the hall closet, and I'd walked past the office without thinking. But when I came back down the hallway, I stopped just outside the doorframe. My son-in-law, Derek, was standing near my desk, with his arms crossed, his eyes moving slowly from the filing cabinet to the framed certificates on the wall, then to the bookshelves. He wasn't reading anything. He was calculating. "Derek," I said. He turned around and smiled. It was a good smile. I'll give him that. The kind that arrives quickly and stays a beat too long. "Sorry, Walter," he said. "Just admiring your setup in here. You've got quite the collection." I nodded and said nothing else. I closed the office door as we walked back to the living room, where my daughter was laughing with her son, my grandson. Marcus and I stood there watching Derek put his arm around her shoulder, and I thought, a man doesn't look at filing cabinets the way a child looks at a Christmas tree, unless he's already decided something belongs to him. I told myself I was being suspicious. I was 63 years old, recently retired after 31 years as a civil engineer, and my daughter had been married to Derek Calloway for 4 years, without a single incident that warranted concern. My wife, Patricia, had passed 2 years prior. Grief does strange things to a man's perception. Makes him see threats where there are none. I let it go. I should not have let it go. My name is Walter Greer. For most of my working life, I was unremarkable in all the ways that matter publicly. I drove a practical car, wore practical clothes, and spoke only when I had something worth saying. What very few people outside my immediate circle knew was that I had spent the last decade quietly accumulating a real estate portfolio across 4 states. Nothing flashy, nothing that appeared in any publication, just steady, patient work that Patricia and I had done together, starting with a single rental property in Charlotte, the year Claire was born. By the time Patricia died, we had 31 properties, a substantial investment account, and a trust that I had restructured twice with our attorney. The total value was not something I discussed, not with neighbors, not with colleagues, not with anyone who didn't need to know. Claire knew we were comfortable. She did not know the full picture, because Patricia and I had always believed that children should build their own lives without the weight of inherited expectation pressing down on them. We had paid for Claire's education, helped her with the down payment on her house, and given generously at Christmas, but we had never handed her a number. Derek, I would come to understand, had spent 4 years trying to find that number on his own. The second time I noticed something, it was 6 weeks after Marcus's birthday party. Derek had started coming over more frequently, sometimes with Claire, sometimes alone, under the pretext of helping me with yard work or fixing a loose gutter. I appreciated the gesture, or I tried to. He was handy enough, and the conversation was pleasant. He asked about my properties in a casual way, the kind of casual that takes practice. "How's the market in Raleigh? Are you thinking of selling any of the Charlotte places? What do you figure the one in Asheville is worth these days?" I answered vaguely. I always answered vaguely when money came up, with anyone. It was simply my nature. But one afternoon in October, Derek arrived without calling ahead. Claire was at work. I was in the kitchen reading, and when I opened the front door, he was standing there with a 6-pack of beer and a smile that arrived too quickly, the same way it always did. "Thought I'd come by and take a look at that water heater," he said. Claire mentioned it was making noise. The water heater had not been making noise. I had not mentioned the water heater to Claire. I knew this because the water heater was 3 years old and functioned perfectly. "Sure," I said. "Come in." I showed him to the utility room and busied myself in the kitchen, leaving the door between the 2 rooms cracked open about 2 inches. I'm not proud of this. But something in the rhythm of that visit felt wrong in a way I couldn't yet name, and I have learned over 63 years to trust the feeling before I can explain it. I heard Derek moving around in the utility room. Then I heard a drawer open. There is only one drawer in my utility room, and it contains nothing of consequence. Spare batteries, a flashlight, a roll of electrical tape. But next to the utility room is a small storage area, and in that storage area, I keep a fireproof lockbox. I heard the storage area door open. I walked around through the hallway so he wouldn't hear my footsteps from the kitchen side, and I appeared in the utility room doorway. Derek was standing with his hand on the lockbox, not attempting to open it, just resting his palm on the top the way you might touch something you're deciding whether to pick up. "Find the issue?" I asked. He pulled his hand back and gestured toward the water heater. "Looks fine to me. Might have been a one-time thing." "Probably," I said. He stayed for 40 minutes and drank 2 of the beers he'd brought and talked about Marcus's new job and the neighbors 2 streets over who'd sold their house for a surprising number. I answered everything pleasantly. When he left, I stood at the window and watched his truck until it turned the corner. Then I called my attorney. His name is Raymond Cho, and he has handled my affairs for 19 years. I told him what I had observed, the questions about property values, the unannounced visit, the hand on the lockbox, and Raymond listened without interrupting, the way he always does. "Has anything changed in your estate documents recently?" he asked when I finished. "Not since last spring." "And Claire, is she aware of the full scope of the trust?" "No." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Walter, I want to be careful here. We can't assume intent from behavior, but I'd suggest we take a few precautionary steps. Move the lockbox. Update the access protocols on your accounts, and I'd like to schedule a meeting with you to review your beneficiary designations." We scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday. I moved the lockbox that evening. Over the next 3 weeks, I began paying a different kind of attention. Not paranoid attention, I want to be clear about that. I had spent 31 years managing large infrastructure projects, which means I had spent 31 years managing people, reading situations, catching the small errors before they became catastrophic ones. I applied those same habits now, quietly, without changing anything about the way I behaved around Derek or Claire. What I found disturbed me more than I had expected. Derek had, in the past 8 months, spoken with 3 separate real estate agents in my area. I learned this not through any sophisticated investigation, but because one of those agents was the husband of a woman I'd served on a library board with for 6 years, and she mentioned it over coffee, in a way that was clearly meant to be informative. He was asking a lot of questions about estate sales, she told me, properties that come onto the market after someone passes. I thought it was a little odd, him being so young. Derek was 41. I also learned, through a conversation with Marcus, who is 21, and perceptive in the way that young men raised well tend to be, that Derek had been asking questions about my health. Not concerned questions. Logistical ones. Had I seen a doctor recently? Did I drive myself to appointments? Was I still managing the properties on my own, or had I hired someone to help? Marcus told me this over lunch, frowning slightly. I didn't think much of it at the time, Grandpa. But he asked 3 times in different ways, and it started to feel like he was fishing. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him you were the sharpest person I knew, and you'd probably outlive all of us. I squeezed my grandson's shoulder and changed the subject. But that evening I sat in my office for a long time without turning on the light. Here is what I understood by then. Derek Calloway was not a violent man or a cruel one, in the obvious sense. He was something more patient and more dangerous. He was a man who had identified an opportunity and was building toward it methodically, the way a careful person builds anything incrementally, plausibly, without leaving fingerprints. He was positioning himself to know exactly what I had, exactly where it was, and exactly what the path would look like when I was no longer in the picture. Whether no longer in the picture meant dead or simply diminished, moved to a care facility, declared incompetent, isolated from my own finances, I could not yet say. What I could say was that my daughter was married to this man and appeared to have no idea what he was doing. That last part is the one that kept me awake. I want to be honest about something uncomfortable. Part of why Derek had gotten this far was because of me. Not because I had been naive, I hadn't, but because I had been remote. After Patricia died, I had pulled inward in the way that some men do when they lose the person who kept them tethered to the world. I had managed my grief by managing my work, which meant I had seen Claire less, called less, been present for her in a diminished way for nearly 2 years. Derek had moved into that space. He had been there for dinners I didn't attend and conversations I wasn't part of, and in my absence, he had slowly made himself indispensable in a household where my daughter was lonely and still grieving her mother. I had let that happen. I would have to live with that. But I was not going to let it continue. The strategy I developed with Raymond over the following month was not dramatic. It was methodical, which is the only kind of strategy I know how to execute. We restructured the trust so that no single event, my death, my incapacitation, even a legal challenge, could result in a rapid transfer of assets to any individual without a 60-day review period and the sign-off of 2 independent trustees. We moved the bulk of my liquid assets into accounts that required dual authorization. We updated every beneficiary designation. And Raymond drafted a letter, notarized and dated, that documented my current state of mind and competency, to be held on file as a matter of record. None of this was visible to Derek. He continued coming over. He continued asking his careful, casual questions. I continued answering vaguely and watching. The moment I had been waiting for arrived on a Tuesday evening in November, when Claire called me from her car. She sounded strange, not upset, exactly, but stretched thin in the way people sound when they are holding something together by willpower alone. "Dad," she said, "can I come over? I need to talk to you." She arrived 20 minutes later and sat at my kitchen table with her coat still on, which told me she wasn't sure she was staying. I made coffee and put it in front of her and sat down across from her and waited. "Derek wants to talk to you about something," she said. "He wants to talk to you about your properties." "All right," I said. "He has an idea." She stopped, looked at her hands. "He wants to propose managing them for you, taking over the day-to-day. He thinks it would be easier for you, and he has some contacts in commercial development who he says could increase the returns significantly." "Does he?" I said. "He's been researching it. He has a whole presentation." She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I recognized. Not suspicion exactly, but discomfort. The look of a person who has been asked to deliver a message they are not entirely sure they believe in. "He thinks you're getting to an age where this kind of thing might be a lot to manage alone." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She was 54 years old and she was tired, and she had been carrying something she hadn't told me about yet, and I needed to choose my next words very carefully. "Claire," I said, "do you want him to do this?" She was quiet. "I'm asking you directly," I said, "not what Derek wants. What do you want?" She picked up the coffee mug and held it with both hands. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I just know that lately he talks about your properties more than he talks about almost anything else. And it doesn't feel right. But when I try to say that, he tells me I'm being unsupportive." There it was. "Claire," I said, "I need to tell you some things, and I need you to hear them without defending him. At least not yet. Can you do that?" She nodded. I told her everything. I told her about the filing cabinet, the unannounced visit, the lockbox, the real estate agents, the questions to Marcus. I told her about the meeting with Raymond and the steps we had taken. I did not soften it or frame it carefully. She was my daughter, and she deserved the truth delivered plainly. When I finished, she didn't say anything for almost a full minute. "I've seen things," she finally said. "Small things. I told myself I was overreacting." She exhaled. "There's a folder on his laptop. He doesn't know I've seen it. It has your name on it, and the name of a care facility in Greensboro." The room was very quiet. "I didn't open it," she said. "I was afraid of what I'd find." "You don't need to open it," I said. "I think we already know what's in it." What followed over the next 3 weeks was the most painful part of all of this, not the confrontation with Derek, which I will get to, but the time before it. Watching my daughter process the fact that the man she had built a life with had been studying her father the way a contractor studies a building he plans to renovate. She didn't leave the house. She didn't confront him. We agreed, she and I and Raymond, that we needed to let Derek make his move so that the record was clear, so that there was no ambiguity, no room for him to reframe any of it as misunderstanding. He made his move on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks later, when he arrived at my house with a laptop and a printed document and a smile that had never once been genuine. I let him set up at my kitchen table. I let him open the presentation. I let him walk me through 11 slides about property management fees and development projections, and here it was, a section titled Care and Transition Planning, in which he proposed, with graphs and bullet points, that I consider a residential care option so that I could focus on quality of life rather than asset management. He had a facility already picked out. It was in Greensboro. I let him finish. Then I folded my hands on the table and I said, "Derek, I'd like to ask you a few questions before I respond." He said, "Of course." "The real estate agents you met with in August and September," I said, "were those meetings on your own behalf, or were you representing me?" His expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, he was practiced, but slightly. "I was doing research," he said, "for you, to understand the market." "I see. And the folder on your laptop with my name on it, the one that includes the brochure for the Greensboro facility, how long have you been working on that?" The shift was less subtle now. "And the lockbox in my utility room," I said. "What were you hoping to find in it?" He said nothing. "Here is what's going to happen," I said. "You're going to leave this house. You're not going to contact me directly about my finances, my properties, or my health ever again. If you have something to say to me, it goes through Raymond Cho, whose number you do not have, but whose name I'm sure you can find. And you're going to go home and have an honest conversation with my daughter, who already knows everything I've just said and has known for 3 weeks." He closed the laptop. "Walter," he started. "I'm not finished," I said. "I want you to understand something. I'm not angry at you in the way you might expect. I'm 63 years old, and I have watched people make calculations about other people's lives for a very long time. I understand the logic of what you were attempting, even if I find the character of it disappointing. What I am is clear, and I want you to be clear too. There is nothing in my estate, my accounts, or my filing cabinet that will ever be accessible to you. Raymond has made certain of that. And if you make any attempt to challenge that, legally or otherwise, you will find that I have been considerably more thorough than you anticipated." He picked up his laptop and his printed document, and he left. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after the door closed. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, the way it does in November, and the house was very quiet, and I thought about Patricia, the way I still do when the house gets quiet. I thought about the 31 years we had built together, the properties, the trust, the slow and patient accumulation of something solid, and I thought about how strange it was that the thing requiring the most protection right now was not money or real estate, but my daughter, and whether I had done enough, and whether I had done it in time. Claire filed for divorce 8 weeks later. I will not pretend that was painless. Divorce is never painless, even when it is right, even when everyone involved understands why it is necessary. She moved through it with a quiet dignity that reminded me of her mother, and I stayed close in the way I should have stayed close years ago, when grief had made me retreat. We had dinners twice a week. I called more than I used to. I was present in the way that I had failed to be, and I did not pretend that the failure hadn't happened. Marcus, for his part, handled it with the practical steadiness of someone who had already suspected more than he'd said. "I'm glad you talked to her, Grandpa," he told me one evening. "I didn't know how to." "You told me what you noticed," I said. "That was enough." There is a version of this story where I focus on what was attempted and feel righteous about having stopped it. I could tell it that way. I could emphasize the planning and the strategy and the moment at the kitchen table and the expression on Derek's face when he understood it was over. That version is available to me. But the version I think about most is the one that starts earlier, the one that starts the year Patricia died, when my daughter was grieving and lonely, and I was too deep in my own loss to stay alongside her. In that version, the space Derek moved into was a space I had left empty. I don't say this to take responsibility for his choices, those were his, fully and completely. But a man who spends 30 years in engineering learns that most catastrophic failures don't begin with the dramatic moment. They begin with the small gap left unaddressed, the minor stress point ignored, the assumption that because something has held so far, it will continue to hold. Claire is doing well now. She took a job she actually likes, something in hospital administration, and she has lunch with a group of women from her neighborhood on Fridays. And she laughs more than she did when Derek was present. Marcus finished his first year at the company he joined and called me with the kind of energy in his voice that young men have when they are discovering what they are capable of. I have dinner with them both every couple of weeks, and we talk about ordinary things, and I am grateful for ordinary things in a way I was not before. I still have the properties, all 31 of them. I have a property manager now, a capable woman named Sandra, who has been in the business for 20 years and charges a reasonable fee, and sends me monthly reports that I review at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Raymond and I meet twice a year to review the trust and make sure everything is current. The lockbox is in a different location. I'm not going to say where. There is one more thing I want to say. For anyone listening to this who has someone in their life, a child, a sibling, a parent who is pulling away at exactly the moment you most need to stay close. Grief and loss have a way of making retreat feel like protection. You tell yourself you are being strong, that you are processing privately, that you are sparing others the burden of your pain. But the people who love you do not experience your absence as protection. They experience it as absence. They fill it with whatever is available. Stay close. That is the whole lesson. Everything else, the attorneys, the lockboxes, the careful documentation, those are responses to a problem. Staying close is how you prevent one. Patricia knew that. She always knew it better than I did. I just needed 63 years and a man with a laptop full of spreadsheets to finally understand it.